Questions orales, oral questions. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, on International Women's Day, my thoughts are with the Yazidi girls in Iraq who are being captured, tortured, raped, and forced to be sex slaves by ISIS. Those who can actually flee with their lives are now languishing in IDP camps. But, Mr. Speaker, we can help them. We can bring them to Canada. With private sponsors that are willing to help, will the Prime Minister commit today to placing these Yazidi girls in the joint sponsorship program so they can come to Canada and find safe haven?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
In the last election, Mr. Speaker, the Liberal Party committed to bringing in 25,000 refugees from Syria, and that's exactly what we did. As we look to how we continue to demonstrate that Canada is an open and welcoming country, we're of course open to all sorts of different suggestions and ways we can continue to demonstrate that Canada is a place that will accept people, not just because they're fleeing tremendous hardship, because they will contribute to the economic growth and the success of this country in the years to come. And I look forward to doing more of that in the months and years to come.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, while the Prime Minister is in Washington this week, he'll be hanging out with his friends from the Centre for American Progress. These are the same anti-Canadian American lobbyists that called our energy sector a dirty business. Meanwhile, Petronas is threatening to cancel its $36 billion investment in British Columbia LNG because of Liberal policies. Mr. Speaker, instead of toasting champagne with anti-Canadian American lobbyists who want to kill Canadian jobs, will the Prime Minister finally stand up for Canada's energy sector?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, a few years ago I went down to Washington and indeed spoke at an event hosted by the Centre for American Progress. Progress is all together. And what I told the Centre for American Progress was that this Canadian Liberal supports the Keystone XL pipeline. I talked about the issues that we need to put forward to promote that, to promote the fact that we can export our resources sustainably and responsibly. Unfortunately, for 10 years, Canada got a black mark, but we had a Prime Minister who refused to put together environment and economy. That's what we're going to do, and that's the message I'm going to give to our friends down south.
L'honorable chef de l'opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, perhaps when the Prime Minister is in Washington, then he can ask President Obama to reverse his decision on Keystone and make Les députés libéraux auront la chance de voter sur la motion conservatrice pour permettre à Bombardier de vendre plus d'avions. Mais les libéraux rendent le tout impossible, et plus particulièrement le secrétaire parlementaire du Premier ministre. Pourquoi le Premier ministre préfère récompenser son ami au lieu d'aider Bombardier à créer de bons emplois?
Premier ministre.
Monsieur le Président, même après leur échec dans les dernières élections, on voit que ces conservateurs veulent encore mettre un coin du pays contre d'autres coins du pays. Nous respectons les désirs et les intérêts et les préoccupations locaux. C'est comme ça qu'on bâtit un pays fort, plutôt que de choisir de miner les différences entre les provinces pour des raisons idéologiques, stratégiques et politiques.
The Honourable Member for Carleton Trail, Eagle Creek.
Mr. Speaker, the Toronto Island Airport is a driver of jobs and economic growth. Allowing it to expand would create a multi-billion-dollar customer for the new Bombardier C-Series and create thousands of jobs in Toronto and Montreal. The Liberals just don't understand that jobs don't come out of thin air. Will the Minister get out of the way, approve the expansion, and help get the C-Series program off the ground?
Honourable Minister of Transport.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and we're delighted to have heard recently that Air Canada intends to buy 45 airplanes from the C-Series because they believe in this aircraft, which, by the way, is the best in its class in the world. And we can also be proud of the fact that the Quebec government is intending to drop its litigation against Air Canada. We are making progress in creating jobs in the aerospace industry in this country. I'd like to know why the member from Beauce thinks that the C-Series is not an airplane that anybody wants to buy.
Honourable Member for Carleton Trail, Eagle Creek.
Well, Mr.
Order.
Speaker, Bombardier's new plane is quieter than those allowed to land at the Toronto Island Airport when the tripartite agreement was signed in 1983. Rather than block the creation of good jobs, the minister should follow his own advice and use evidence-based decision-making to modernize the regulations governing the use of this airport. Will the minister accept the evidence, consider the thousands of jobs created, and allow the Toronto Island Airport to expand?
Honourable Minister of Transport.
As I said again, I had the opportunity this morning, Mr. Speaker, to make a 20-minute speech because obviously the official opposition has had difficulty in understanding the basis of our decision with respect to the tripartite agreement. We made it very clear that we were achieving the right balance between commercial interests and the interests of the community. We do care about local issues. Unfortunately, this opposition doesn't seem to share the same approach.
Honourable député d'Outremont.
Speaker, a new report released yesterday proves that the pay gap for women in Canada is actually getting worse. Meanwhile, the costs of childcare are astronomical and rising, putting enormous strain on households that include young families and making it more difficult for women to participate in paid work. It's almost always women who wind up making sacrifices in their career when affordable childcare isn't there. The Liberals promised Canadians they would take action on a national childcare program within the first 100 days. Where is it?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
The Liberal Party was elected on a platform investing $20 billion over the next 10 years in social infrastructure, which includes social housing, seniors housing, and affordable childcare. And that approach is what exactly we're going to be put forward in the budget. But it's interesting to me that the member opposite would be talking about that, because right now, if he were government, he would be busy trying to figure out how to cut $18 billion of spending from this government so we could balance the books at every cost, which was the commitment that the NDP made in the election.
Honourable député d'Outremont.
The commitment of the Liberals is for a national childcare program within the first 100 days, and as we've just seen, that's another broken promise. Seulement 33% des femmes sans emploi ont accès à l'assurance emploi, contre 43% des hommes. Encore aujourd'hui, les hommes sont plus susceptibles que les hommes d'occuper un emploi précaire. Est-ce que le Premier ministre, qui se dit féministe, peut nous dire pourquoi les libéraux ont voté hier contre une motion qui aurait permis à des dizaines de milliers de femmes d'accéder à l'assurance emploi?
Bravo!
Président Premier ministre.
Monsieur le Président, les gens au Canada savent très bien qu'on s'est engagé à réformer le système d'assurance-emploi pour aider les Canadiens et les Canadiennes qui en ont besoin. C'est exactement ce que nous sommes en train de faire. Nous travaillons très fort là-dessus et nous allons avoir des choses à dire dans les semaines à venir, surtout avec le dépôt de notre budget.
Honourable député d'Outremont.
Another broken promise. Yesterday's motion contained 3 Liberal promises and they voted against it. Internal documents reveal the government gave a secret sweetheart deal to multi-millionaire tax cheats with no penalties and even a discount on the interest. Once again, we see there are 2 sets of rules, one for the wealthy and another one for everyone else. How many other times has this happened? And is the Prime Minister going to call an investigation into this tax scam for the rich?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
We're, of course, engaged with CRA on the issues brought forward. It is a concern to us that all Canadians pay their fair share of taxes, and we will ensure that that continues to be the case in the future. What decisions made under a previous government, if they're erroneous, we'll look into them for sure.
The Honourable Member for Outremont.
The problem is, as this case illustrates, it is not the case that the rich are paying their fair share, and they are let off the hook by the Canada Revenue Agency. So the question was, is the Prime Minister going to order an investigation to figure out how this happened? He can't hide behind the fact that it was a previous administration. Canadians have a right to know that the tax system is equal for all Canadians. This case proves just the opposite. One set of rules for the rich and another for everyone else. What is the Prime Minister going to do about investigating this case so that Canadians know that there's tax fairness in this country? Stop protecting the rich. Stop protecting a tax system that's fair for all.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
One of the things at the heart of the campaign that led to us forming government was the idea that the previous government had successively given advantages and tax breaks to the wealthiest Canadians and not to middle class and those folks working hard to join the middle class. That's why we stood against the child benefit scheme that the previous government had put forward that was benefiting the wealthiest and not those who needed it the most. That's why we're looking forward to turning around, and it was disappointing to us to see that the NDP sided with the government in giving child benefits to millionaire families when it was other folks who needed it more. That's what we're going to do, and that's what we're elected to do.
The honourable member for Portage Lisgar.
Mr. Speaker, mining is of vital importance to the Canadian economy. It provides hundreds of thousands of jobs, particularly in remote areas and for Aboriginal people. Yesterday, the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada had their annual convention in Toronto. It's one of the world's largest gatherings on mining and mineral exploration. The Prime Minister was also in Toronto yesterday. Why was he unable to stop by the convention to show his support and his interest in Canadian mining?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I was delighted to spend 2 days at the Prospector and Developers Association, and the message that I heard from the prospectors and developers was that they are leading the world in sustainable practices. We told them the message that they have the full support of our government. They are committed to innovation. They are committed to green technologies. It was a partnership that is in the interests of the sector, in the interests of the government, and even in the interests of the opposition.
Order. The honourable member for Portage Lisgar.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister was busy in Toronto yesterday, not with PDAC, with the pandas, however. Mr. Speaker, while he didn't have time for PDAC, he does have time in Washington for his friends, the Centre for American Progress, his pals that he's going to be hanging out with, a blatantly anti-Canadian organization that calls Canadian oil dirty and destructive. They've worked overtime to kill Keystone XL. Does the Prime Minister agree with this group? Why is he spending so much time in Washington with anti-Canadian groups and no time with job creators here in Canada?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Speaker, it may be unusual for the opposition, but this government actually talks to people who disagree with us. And the reason we do that is we believe that the force of argument might even prevail. The Prime Minister has already said that he spoke to the group in support of the pipeline, and we're talking to people right across the country, some of whom have a different view. When you have open ears, you might even be able to learn.
The honourable member for South Surrey White Rock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Petronas, the company supporting LNG in British Columbia, has invested over $12 billion going through and receiving environmental approval, both nationally and provincially. This $36 billion project will create thousands of jobs, but the Liberals have added more red tape, additional barriers, significant costs. Will the Liberals commit today to supporting the BC LNG industry and the Canadian job creation? Yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency is reviewing a number of major LNG projects, including Pacific Northwest. Yesterday, Pacific Northwest submitted substantial new information. This information will be assessed by the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency. We will be evaluating new information submitted by the proponent in an efficient way that meets our obligations to Canadians, as we do for every major project.
The honourable member for South Surrey White Rock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Liberals have blocked the expansion of the Toronto Island Airport, the creation of jobs in the aerospace industry, opposed Energy East, added more red tape to the BC LNG industry, are increasing taxes to the technology sector, increasing taxes for small business. But, Mr. Speaker, we have two pandas named Hope and Joy. Mr. Speaker, is it the Liberals' intention to shut the entire country down?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
We ran on a campaign of hope and hard work, and that's what Canadians supported, Mr. Speaker. And if logic of the member opposite, they would be making massive cuts, billions of dollars. They promote austerity, but we promote growth and creating jobs, Mr. Speaker. We have a plan that's going to invest billions in infrastructure. We have a plan that's going to reduce the tax burden for middle-class Canadians, Mr. Speaker. We have a plan that is going to advance the innovation agenda. We're going to grow the economy and create jobs.
L'honorable député de Beauport, Côte-de-Beaupré, Île-d'Orléans, Charlevoix.
Monsieur le Président, ce gouvernement a ouvert les valves et promet des déficits à outrance. Les familles canadiennes savent qu'il est difficile de joindre les deux bouts et que ce n'est pas en payant l'épicerie avec des cartes de crédit que c'est le fun. Monsieur le Président, ce gouvernement peut-il nous assurer qu'il va arrêter d'utiliser la carte de crédit et d'hypothéquer l'avenir de nos enfants?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire des Finances.
Monsieur le Président, je voudrais remercier mon honorable collègue pour sa question. Monsieur le Président, les conservateurs nous ont laissé un bilan économique lamentable, Monsieur le Président. Mais grâce aux Canadiens, le 19 octobre, les Canadiens ont fait un choix différent, Monsieur le Président. Ils ont fait le choix de la croissance économique, ils ont fait le choix d'investir dans les familles. Nous avons commencé en décembre, Monsieur le Président, en réduisant l'impôt de la classe moyenne. Nous allons continuer avec notre plan historique pour les familles, avec l'allocation canadienne aux enfants, qui va aider des centaines de millions d'enfants au Canada, Monsieur le Président, et 9 familles sur 10. Et nous allons continuer avec notre plan d'investissement historique en infrastructure. C'est ça, travailler pour les Canadiens, Monsieur le Président.
We all know the member for Edmonton, Wetaskiwin, and others can count very well. We appreciate that, but let's not hear it when someone else is speaking. Let's show respect to one another. Honorable député de Beauport, Côte-de-Beaupré, Île-d'Orléans, Charlevoix.
Dernièrement, ce gouvernement se vantait haut et fort de se battre pour la classe moyenne. Permettez-moi d'en douter quand je vois la dette s'accumuler de façon vertigineuse. Leurs dépenses sont motivées par l'idéologie libérale et vont nous nuire à notre économie. Comment le ministre des Finances peut expliquer aux Canadiens que s'endetter va nous enrichir?
Honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Monsieur le Président, je voudrais remercier mon honorable collègue pour sa question. Monsieur le Président, notre vision est complètement différente des conservateurs, Monsieur le Président. Nous allons investir dans la croissance. Monsieur le Président, nous avons réduit l'impôt pour 9 millions de Canadiens. Nous allons continuer d'avoir des mesures pour la classe moyenne. Monsieur le Président, nous allons faire ça de façon responsable. Nous allons continuer avec notre objectif de réduire la dette sur le PIB durant notre mandat. Et oui, nous avons toujours l'objectif de balancer les livres, Monsieur le Président, dans un contexte économique plus difficile. Mais, Monsieur le Président, notre priorité, c'est travailler pour la classe moyenne du pays. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
The honourable member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Access to safe abortion services is fundamental to a woman's right to choose. It must be equally available to all Canadian women. But women in places like PEI do not have access to abortion services, and they should. Commitment to women's rights must be more than talk and promises. It must mean concrete action. And so will this minister commit today to guaranteeing that every woman in every region of the country has access to abortion services?
Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I will remind the honourable member that our government fully supports a woman's right to choose. Our government also recognizes that there are inequities in access to a number of health services, including abortion, across the country. I have been discussing with my provincial and territorial colleagues the fundamentals of the Canada Health Act and the fact that there should be access to all medically necessary services on the basis of need and not on the basis of ability to pay. And I will continue to work with my colleagues to make sure access is available to all Canadians.
Député de Laurier-Sainte-Marie.
Monsieur le Président, les avortements non sécuritaires sont responsables de 13 % de la mortalité liée à la maternité dans le monde. Si on veut sauver des vies, vraiment, il faut agir. Alors, pourquoi est-ce que la ministre du Développement international continue la politique des conservateurs et refuse de financer les services d'avortement à l'étranger, là où c'est permis, et c'est permis dans plusieurs pays? Pourquoi refuse-t-elle de se lever pour les droits des femmes partout dans le monde.
Honorable ministre du Développement international.
Monsieur le Président, je crois que mon honorable collègue a mal compris mon allocution, mon annonce hier. Nous sommes très fiers d'appuyer toute la gamme des services de santé reproductive. Hier, j'étais encore en compagnie du Dr Babatunde du Fonds pour la population des Nations unies et les projets que nous avons annoncés hier ne visaient pas directement l'avortement. Ça ne veut pas dire qu'on est contre. On répondait à une demande qui visait précisément le planning familial, l'éducation sexuelle, les avortements de façon sécuritaire et la lutte contre les maladies transmissibles sexuellement.
The Honourable Member for Milton.
Speaker. In 2003, the Ontario Liberal Party came to power, assuring Canadians and Ontarians that they would reduce debt as conditions and allow. Well, since then, we have $300 billion in debt, which is doubled. $22,000 per person is owed, which is doubled. It's increased faster than any other promise. Now, yesterday, the parliamentary secretary said that he would take no lessons from our successes. So I'm wondering, Mr. Speaker, is it because the Minister of Finance would rather be taking lessons from the disastrous legacies of Kathleen Wynne and Dalton McGuinty and racking up debt?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the honourable colleague for a question. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. We will take no lessons from the Conservative when it comes to deficit. Let me be very clear. Mr. Speaker, our focus is on investing in the middle class and growing the economy. That's what Canadians expect of us, Mr. Speaker. After 10 years of weak economic growth, the worst possible reaction to an economic downturn would be to balance the budget at any cost. This is the kind of blind fixation that Canadians rejected on the 19th of October. Mr. Speaker, Canadians expect us to deliver on growth, on the economy, and you know what? That's exactly what we're going to do.
The Honourable Member for Richmond Centre.
Mr. Speaker, for weeks, the Liberals have been giving mixed signals and dodging questions about small businesses and their job-killing startup tax. Some days they want to increase taxes for everybody, and some days they only want to raise taxes on small business owners. When will the Liberals abandon their job-killing startup tax?
The Minister for Small Business and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Actually, the opposite, Mr. Speaker. This government supports small and medium-sized businesses. We are committed to helping them grow. We're committed to helping them innovate, to become more productive, and to become export-oriented. We have launched the CAN Export Program, which has received a wonderful response. This morning for International Women's Day, I was with Startup Canada for their Women's Day breakfast, and I met a young entrepreneur, a girl in grade 5 by the name of Frankie. Her and her friend have started up a business. The spirit of entrepreneurship is here. This government recognizes that small businesses are job creators and will grow the economy.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the minister said that the Liberals would, quote, do justice to caregivers. And today we learned what that meant. The Liberals are cutting 8,000 spots this year via the caregiver immigration stream. This program provides vital support for families who are looking after loved ones with physical or mental disabilities. These changes leave the most vulnerable Canadians without care. Why have they chosen to cut 27% of the immigration spots available to caregivers?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for her question. In respect to caregivers, Mr. Speaker, this House and this government stands behind the significant contribution that caregivers make to Canadian society. We stand by our campaign commitments, which is to eliminate the LMIA fee of $1,000 that is required to hire a caregiver. We also stand behind our commitment to work with provinces and territories to facilitate the work and the hiring of caregivers. Caregivers represent a significant contribution to this country. We recognize that, and we're working on processing their claims expeditiously. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
So recognizing a contribution means an 8,000-person cut. This government has also cut the numbers of spots available under the Federal Skilled Worker in Canada Experience class by 21%. These cuts to economic immigration come at a time when our workforce is aging, our economy is slowing, and refugees are waiting for months to have long-term affordable housing. In this context, can the Minister explain how he plans to provide the services needed to ensure that their planned 250% increase in refugees is successful, and how much this will cost?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, in terms of I thank the honourable member for her question. In terms of our specifics that were announced today, let me elaborate on the plan. It considers the economic needs of this country, it considers the pressing needs for family reunification, and our humanitarian traditions, which are important vis-à-vis refugees and people coming in under the H&C category. With respect to the economic needs of this country, we hear these needs loud and clear. We are responding to them. The levels that we have announced are over 50% of the overall targets of immigrants that we are bringing to this country. That is responsive to Canadian industry, to Canadian business, and to making this country prosper and grow. Thank you.
Honorable député de Jonquière.
Monsieur le Président, une nouvelle étude nous apprend que les femmes gagnent maintenant 72% du salaire des hommes. C'est une discrimination inacceptable qui affecte injustement les femmes. Grâce à l'initiative du NPD, un comité parlementaire proposera un plan d'action pour enfin atteindre l'équité salariale. Est-ce que le gouvernement s'engage aujourd'hui à adopter la loi proactive sur l'équité salariale pour qu'enfin les femmes puissent concrétiser un slogan scandé depuis trop longtemps, à travail égal, salaire égal? Merci.
Bravo, bravo. Honourable Minister for the Status of Women.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for her question. Having a gender wage gap in Canada in 2016 is unacceptable. As the first commitment towards pay equity, our Prime Minister appointed a gender-balanced cabinet. We're firmly committed to a public service that reflects the diversity of society, which includes gender parity, and we've supported the appointment of a special committee on pay equity. We will continue to lead by example and work with all members of this House and our provincial and territorial partners to close the gap. Thank you.
Honourable member for Churchill-Kiwatinook-Askey.
It's not just about wages, Mr. Speaker. Women are also far more likely to be engaged in precarious work. 2/3 of all part-time workers and more than half of all temporary workers in Canada are women. This makes it harder for women to earn a stable income, to afford food, to afford rent, and to qualify for programs like employment insurance. So why did the Liberals let Canadian women down by voting against lowering the threshold on EI?
The Honourable Minister of Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member across the way for the question. It is absolutely true that the gap that is growing for women, and that more and more are not able to access the very services that they deserve. That is why we committed during the election to review the EI system, modernize it, and bring it into today's world, which will serve all Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Fundy Royal.
Mr. Speaker, today is International Women's Day, a day when we celebrate women's achievements and their potential in Canada and globally. Speaking of achievements, we saw a record number of 88 women elected to this House in the last election. The Prime Minister appointed an equal number of women and men to Cabinet. Can the Minister of the Status of Women inform us of other actions this government is taking to ensure women can participate more actively in democratic and public life?
Now the Minister for the Status of Women.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member from Fundy Royal for her question. This government is committed to advancing gender equality in all areas of Canadian life. International Women's Day theme this year is Women's Empowerment Leads to Equality. I recently launched a call for proposals for projects that will increase women's participation by supporting the work of Indigenous women in their communities and amplifying the voices of women working to enhance their civic and political participation. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke.
Mr. Speaker, ISIL has declared war on Canada, yet the Prime Minister responds to the women and men who died and fought in Afghanistan with the message that their efforts were worthless by ending the CF-18 air cover. How many deaths overseas and here at home will it take for the Prime Minister to accept that some campaign promises are made to be broken?
The Well, the Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, I think we can agree upon and we share that ISIL is a horrible threat. We just have a different opinion on how we're going to achieve the defeat of this horrible entity. And to only do this, and from our experience, it's going to happen on the ground. To be able to achieve the outcome, we need to be able to train enough Iraqi security forces, making sure they have the right intelligence to create the right plan. And hence the reason why we have tripled our trainers, doubled the intelligence, and I hope that the opposition votes with us in supporting our plan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Simcoe Grey.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday we asked the Minister of Veterans Affairs to give Canadians an explanation to why the Liberals are cancelling the Afghanistan War Memorial. 40,000 brave men and women in Afghanistan, some of which trained in my riding of Baysport and served there. All he had to say was more information regarding this project will be available in coming months. Mr. Speaker, why won't the Liberals honour our veterans? And why can't this minister provide a straight answer? Pourquoi ce gouvernement libéral et ce ministre ont-ils annulé les projets des monuments commémoratifs de la guerre en Afghanistan?
Voilà.
The Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Well, I'm surprised at the question because, frankly, I thought I answered it very clearly yesterday. But it's very important to honor the men and women who served in Afghanistan. In 2014, an all-party motion was put forward, and it was accepted by this House. And I can tell you, I am working very closely with the Minister of Heritage to see this memorial built.
There you go.
Honourable member for Elgin, Middlesex, London.
Mr. Speaker, Conservatives balanced the budget, and we helped families balance the budget. The Conservative family tax cuts enhanced duties for childcare, helped 100% of families and kids, and gave back $2,000 of their own money. Families can and have to balance their budget. The Liberals can't and won't balance their budget. Why do the Liberals insist on taking benefits away from increasing families for hardworking mums and dads to pay for their out-of-control spending?
Honourable Ministre du Développement Social.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to hear this question because that matter was a very important element of our platform in the last elections and contributed to elect a government that is very sensitive both to economic growth and to inclusive growth. And I think we will have very good news in a matter of a few days, which I think all the House is looking forward to, including the members opposite.
The honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Mr. Speaker, last week we heard that the Prime Minister's brother was lobbying the Minister of Public Safety to bring a terrorist Canadian citizenship restored. Then we have the Agriculture Minister hiring his Chief of Staff, the owner of somebody with a big interest in egg farms in Canada. And then we have the Justice Minister's husband lobbying her on behalf of his own company. And then we have the House Leader and his Chief of Staff cozying up to the Irvings. So my question is, does the Prime Minister not understand conflict of interest?
Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, what the Prime Minister understands is the importance of raising the bar on accountability and transparency from the shabby record in front of us. And that's why when our government was elected, we took unprecedented steps to bring more openness and more transparency to government, and that includes always abiding by the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner's advice. That's what ministers in this government have done and will continue to do.
Churchill River.
Mr. Speaker, Indigenous women in Canada are more likely to be victims of violence. Many studies have shown that being a survivor of violence has a significant impact on mental health. But for women on reserve in rural and remote communities, mental health supports and services are often inadequate or non-existent. Will the Health Minister work with Indigenous communities to ensure that culturally sensitive mental health services are available to all women?
Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased pleased to respond to this important question, and I would agree with the member opposite that for women in particular, violence, and particularly for Indigenous women, can often contribute to real challenges in mental health. We are fully committed as a government to responding to the mental health needs of Canadians. The Prime Minister has asked me to make sure that we increase access to mental health services for all Canadians, and I would particularly be interested in working with the member opposite to ensure that we can provide adequate mental health services to Indigenous women and men in her community and all Canadian communities.
Monsieur le Président, au cours de la dernière année, des centaines de femmes ont pris courageusement la parole pour dénoncer le harcèlement et la violence dont elles avaient été victimes. Ce sont des problèmes systémiques qui nécessitent une réponse politique. Depuis des années, les groupes de femmes demandent un plan d'action national et des investissements pour davantage de places dans les centres d'hébergement. Est-ce que la ministre peut nous dire quand, et je dis bien quand, le gouvernement va écouter ces femmes et présenter un plan d'action pour enfin mettre fin à ce fléau?
Minister for the Status of Women.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for her passion on this issue. I'm extremely proud to lead the development of a federal gender-based violence strategy. I'm working closely with my provincial and territorial colleagues right now as we speak, consulting with NGOs who have spent a great amount of time working and exploring this issue, and we should have something to talk about near June. Thank you.
The honourable member for Lakeland.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is going to Washington this week to hang out with the Anti-Canadian Energy Centre for American Progress and the Liberal organization Canada 2020. Canada 2020's founders are Liberal lobbyists who are registered to lobby the PMO and other federal departments. At the same time, the Liberals have been raising money by promising a free trip to the Canada 2020 events in Washington. The Liberals have been told to quit doing this. Why are the Liberals still using their government positions to help out their Liberal lobbyist friends while fundraising on behalf of the same old Liberal Party?
Good question. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, as I've said in the House before, at all times the Liberal Party has complied and will continue to apply with the election financing legislation. It's somewhat ironic that members sitting on the other side raise people that don't respect election financing laws, because I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, nobody on this side has left in leg irons.
Honourable member for Yorkton Melville.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the President of Canada 2020 is Tom Pitfield. His spouse is the President of the Liberal Party. They are both self-described friends of the Prime Minister. Understandable. The Conflict of Interest Act is clear. You cannot further the interests of your friends. And the Prime Minister himself is in a fundraising email from his friend, the President of the Liberal Party, offering access for cash. Why is the Prime Minister trying to promote his friends and raise money for the Liberal Party on a supposed official state visit?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we're very proud of what the Prime Minister and ministers will accomplish on the important state visit to Washington. It's an unprecedented honour for Canada, and substantive files will be advanced, and job creation will be a priority on this side of the House, and in discussions at the White House and with other secretaries in the American administration. At all times, we will keep the economic and social needs of Canadians at the forefront. And, Mr. Speaker, drive-by smears about phony fundraising events aren't, frankly, honourable in this House.
Order. 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 Let's have some order here. There's some danger of there being fewer questions. So, member for Lethbridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Liberal Party is using this trip and its position as government to fill party coffers in order to help out their friends of the Prime Minister. At Christmas time, the Liberals were told that they had to stop this cash for access flow. This is exactly what they're doing now, however, only 3 short months later. They seem to be promising donors access to the Prime Minister and the ministers who are going with him. And we've seen this all before with the Liberals. So my question is, why do the Liberals continue to blur the lines between their party and their position as government?
Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians will find it somewhat ironic that the other side of the House would be lecturing anybody about using government to advance partisan interests. What we can say, Mr. Speaker, is with respect to this particular event, the member knows very well that no donation was required. This is a normal social media competition that all parties have done. And, Mr. Speaker, at all times, the Liberal Party and members on this side of the House respect election financing legislation, something that colleagues on the other side have had considerable trouble doing.
Honorable député de Longueuil, Charles Lemoyne.
Monsieur le Président, la semaine dernière, le Premier ministre et le ministre de l'Environnement ont participé à la conférence Globe à Vancouver. Cette conférence a mis l'accent au niveau des solutions en termes d'énergie propre. Comme nous le disons depuis le début, il est temps de cesser de mettre l'environnement et l'économie en opposition l'un à l'autre, surtout alors que les programmes tels que ceux d'énergie propre encouragent le développement des deux. La ministre de l'Environnement peut-elle nous informer des rencontres qu'elle a entretenues lors de cette conférence? Merci.
Honorable ministre de l'Environnement.
Je remercie mon honorable collègue. J'ai eu le plaisir de participer au sommet Globe, la conférence la plus importante consacrée à l'innovation en affaires dont l'accent est mis sur l'environnement et l'énergie verte. Mon secrétaire parlementaire et député de North Vancouver s'est joint à moi dans mes discussions portant sur l'établissement du leadership en matière de changement climatique en collaboration avec les provinces et territoires. Le gouvernement du Canada s'est engagé à stimuler l'innovation, à favoriser la croissance propre et l'efficacité en matière de ressources. Merci.
The honourable member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Mr. Speaker, there's a recent lawsuit by the SSN and it's looking to declare Aboriginal title over private property. The Premier of British Columbia responded that government must defend with conviction the sanctity of private land and private land rights. Furthermore, she told the people of Kamloops she's got their back. No such message from the federal government. Will the Justice Minister stand up shoulder to shoulder with the province of BC and defend private property ownership?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for the question. Our government is committed to developing a substantive nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples in this country, sitting down and working jointly based on recognition and moving forward in order to ensure that Indigenous communities can have an improved quality of life, can settle ultimately the land question and do it based on respect and based on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
The honourable member for London Fanshawe.
Mr. Speaker, one of the best ways to achieve equality for women in Canada is to have the House of Commons actually reflect our population. Women make up over 50% of Canada's population, yet only 26% of parliamentarians are women. Now, the member for Burnaby South has proposed legislation that will help achieve gender equality in Parliament. Will the Minister of Democratic Institutions commit her government to supporting this very important legislation?
The Honourable Minister of Democratic Institutions.
Mr. Speaker, we intend to undertake a meaningful and inclusive conversation with all Canadians to bring our electoral system into the 21st century. We're doing this because here in Canada, we can do better. For us and for the next generation, we need to do this so that more 14-year-old girls like Veronica from my riding of Peterborough-Kawartha can feel compelled to be engaged in the democratic process.
The honourable member for Scarborough Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my riding of Scarborough Centre is one of the most diverse communities in Canada. The Prime Minister came to my campaign office during the election and promised to repeal the second-class citizenship provisions of Bill C-24, telling my constituents that a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. Could the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship update the House on his progress on this promise to restore the integrity of Canadian citizenship?
Parliamentary Secretary for Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to inform this House that we are meeting this important campaign commitment. Bill C-24, enacted by the previous Conservative government, set a very dangerous precedent. It created 2 tiers of citizenship in this country, Mr. Speaker. Regardless of whether you were born here or whether you were born abroad, like myself and many members of this House, Mr. Speaker, you deserve a government that values and respects your citizenship. A Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian, Mr. Speaker. The Liberal Party believes this. Canadians recognize this, and with Bill C-6, we will be implementing this and putting this important fundamental principle back into our immigration system. Thank you.
Honorable député de Repentigny.
Monsieur le Président, eh oui, une femme et féministe va vous parler de libre-échange. Dans le dossier du bois d'œuvre, les Américains ont toujours perdu devant les tribunaux de l'OMC et de l'ALENA, et l'industrie forestière du Québec, elle, n'a rien à se reprocher. Elle a toujours respecté l'entente. La position du gouvernement devrait être fort simple. Il n'y a rien à négocier. Le gouvernement va-t-il informer les Américains que l'entente sur le bois d'œuvre, elle est conclue et qu'elle s'appelle ALENA?
Honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie l'honorable député pour sa question. Oui, l'ALENA fait partie de l'encadrement des enjeux sur la question du bois d'œuvre, mais il y a aussi d'autres enjeux à travers le pays, soit au Québec, soit en Colombie-Britannique. Nous sommes conscients des enjeux. Nous sommes en train de s'assurer qu'on aura un accès stable, juste et équitable au marché américain. C'est ce qu'on a promis, c'est ce qu'on va faire, Monsieur le Président.
Honorable député Dominique Coigan.
Monsieur le Président, alors que le ministre des Affaires étrangères prône le retour au libre-échange dans le dossier du bois d'œuvre, la ministre du Commerce international nous répète depuis plusieurs semaines que ses fonctionnaires négocient une nouvelle entente. Pourtant, l'industrie forestière québécoise ne souhaite qu'une chose, le retour du libre-échange, comme le prévoit l'ALENA au chapitre du bois d'œuvre. Qui parle au nom de ce gouvernement? Le ministre des Affaires étrangères, qui prône le libre-échange, ou la ministre du Commerce international, qui négocie une entente non adaptée à l'industrie forestière québécoise?
Honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
Monsieur le Président, la question est une priorité pour notre gouvernement. Notre position demeure pareille, il n'y a pas changé. Monsieur le Président, on veut s'assurer un accès stable, juste et équitable. On comprend les diverses positions à travers ce pays. On travaille avec nos homologues à travers le pays et avec nos partenaires américains, justement pour avoir une solution qui est juste, équitable et stable.
It was wonderful today to see so many questions and many of the answers on this International Women's Day from women. How about a hand for them?